Dr. Arteagoitia is a research scientist at the Center for Applied Linguistics in Washington, D.C., and her research focuses on language and literacy instruction in linguistically and culturally diverse classrooms. Her most recent work, funded by the U.S. Department of Education, investigated characteristics of dual language bilingual instruction in high-achieving programs by analyzing statewide longitudinal data in the two program languages. She's published her research in peer-reviewed publications, including TESOL Quarterly, Bilingual Research Journal, and the Journal of Bilingual Education Research and Instruction. We're very happy to have you here today and excited to hear from you. Thank you.
There we go. Okay, so I'm going to be sharing my screen in a minute, but I just wanted to welcome you all, say good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this speaker series. I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to participate in other series, but I was able to attend Tris Morita Mulani's talk last month, which I very much enjoyed. And for those of you who were in attendance, some of the pictures of the Chinese schools that she showed really reminded me of my bilingual school in the Basque Country in Spain. We started in the living room of one of my classmates, and then we moved to the underground of a church where the priest, the Catholic priest, helped cover the fact that the majority of the instruction in that school was facilitated in Basque. This was back in the mid 60s to mid 70s, the last decade of an almost 40-year dictatorship that we had in Spain. So as you can see, my connection to bilingual education goes back many, many years to my childhood, and in particular to that bilingual program. Because even though my grandparents were native speakers of Basque, unfortunately, my parents did not speak Basque. So Basque was not the language of my home. You know, because my parents didn't have the opportunity to attend a bilingual program, and also back then Basque was considered, at least by some, by those in power, as the language of the uneducated. So my grandparents did not, did not pass it on, unfortunately. So that's to show how fast language loss can occur within a family. So let me share my screen here. Okay, let me see. Wait a minute. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a trouble because I have several screens here, so I want to make sure that I'm sharing the correct screen. Okay, here we go. I think I got it. Okay, so I think you're seeing the title page. So I'm going to be talking about bilingual programs, a type of bilingual program, dual language bilingual education in this country, and about a research project that we did a few years ago, looking at dual language programs in one state in the US. But before that, here we go. Before that, just like Carrie did, I'd like to acknowledge the land where I stand, where I'm joining you from, Washington, D.C., which is the ancestral land of the Anacostans. The Anacostia is the name of one of our rivers here. And just to say that this is only meant to serve as a first step, of course, in honoring the land, the history, and the people. And without action, of course, it's just an empty gesture that doesn't replace authentic relationships with indigenous communities, but still important to acknowledge. One quick slide about the Center for Applied Linguistics, CAL, para los amigos y amigas, where I work. It's a nonprofit organization that's been around for more than 65 years now. Our mission is to promote language learning and cultural understanding. And our work focuses on language and culture as they relate to access and equity. In education, in particular, the bulk of our work focuses on pre-K through 12 education, but we also work with adults learning English or learning a world language. Okay, so moving on to the research project. The name of the project was Features of Dual Language Immersion in High Achieving Programs. It was a 4-year project funded by the U.S. Department of Education, their International Research and Studies program. And what motivated us to submit a proposal for this grant that we got was the fact that, you know, there was we were seeing, of course, everybody was seeing an increase in the number of dual language programs nationwide. We've seen that in the last decade or two, which is very exciting. At the same time, there is a lot of variation in the way these programs are implemented. There are a lot of different models when it comes to instructional time in one language and the other, but also the students that the programs serve. And even though there has been, you know, quite a bit of research done in the past couple of decades that has focused on these programs and the benefits that, you know, the benefits when it comes to student outcomes, there's really not as much when it comes to what is it beyond student outcomes that make these programs successful when implemented with fidelity, right? So the 3 main objectives of the research project were to work with one state and identify successful dual language programs by starting with student outcome data, longitudinal. We ended up getting 3 years of data, reading data in the 2 program languages. And from that to select a couple of the 2 programs that were doing the best job at serving all of the students that they serve. In our case, they were all so-called two-way programs that served both students that came from homes that spoke their partner language, and then students that didn't speak their partner language. They were predominantly English monolingual students when they enter the program. And so we wanted to see which programs did the best job at serving both groups of students, but also in the 2 languages. And then from there, we would select a couple of programs just to do more qualitative analysis to get at those the nuances, the characteristics that made them good programs beyond, you know, the fact that they were doing a good job at the reading scores of these students. And then the final objective was to disseminate the results of the project so that it could be replicated and its results applied in programs with similar objectives. So hopefully I'll have time to talk about the one biliteracy study that we did that we were able to publish in TESOL Quarterly, which I shared with Amanda, and maybe some of you have had the chance to at least take a look at. So when it comes to the project itself, we had 2 main research questions. The first one was, which dual language programs in the state of Oregon have consistently reported high reading achievement in Spanish and English for native speakers of English and native speakers of Spanish after controlling for student level and program level characteristics. Before I move on to the second one, I want to say that our intention was not to limit it to just Spanish English dual language programs, because Oregon does have programs with Russian, Chinese, Arabic, Japanese, and French. However, it was essential for us, crucial to have data in both languages. And in the end, unfortunately, the only programs that have been collecting data, summative data in the two languages were Spanish, English, dual language programs. So that's why the question is phrased that way. And then the second one, what features of dual language education are documented in programs that result in high reading achievement in Spanish and English for native speakers of English and native speakers of Spanish? Okay, so starting with the first research question, to answer the first research question, we did quantitative analysis on 3 years of reading achievement data that we got directly from the Oregon Department of Education. They were fabulous. Their data people were great to work with. To identify 2 programs out of a pool of 19 programs, that was our where we started, that consistently over those 3 years, these were students, well, data from students that were in 3rd grade, and then their data in 4th grade and 5th grade. So 3 data points that showed consistently the highest adjusted average scores in both languages and for both groups of students. Okay, a lot of these I've said already. There were 19 programs that were across the state. So they were pretty spread out in 11 different districts, and they varied also in terms of their size. So some of them were just strand programs. They just had 1 classroom per grade level to, 21 students. And then the other, all the way up to 95 students. That's probably 3 or 4 classrooms for this 3rd grade, since we work with 3rd grade data and then 4th and 5th. In terms of the program variables, we had out of the 19, 12 with whole school programs. The whole school was a dual language, dual language school, and then 7 were only strand programs. 12, not necessarily the same 12, but 12 had a 50-50 model, meaning that they started teaching 50% of the time in Spanish and 50% of the time in English in kindergarten. The other 7 they had more instructional time in Spanish in the early grades. And then progressively they got to a 50-50 model. And there was a lot of variation. There were some that were more 90-10, 80-20, even 70-20, but we grouped them all together as more than 50% of instructional time in Spanish in those early grades. And then in terms of the program, they were all so-called two-way program. They call themselves two-way. But when you dig a little deeper, you realize that actually they had many more students, speakers of Spanish, many of them, than of English. So they really didn't have that 1/3 that we say it's the minimum requirement for a two-way program, which ideally is, more or less the same amount of students of one language and the other, so that from home, so that they can serve as language models for each other. But the bare minimum is like 1/3. You have to have at least 1/3 of speakers of Spanish and at least 1/3 of speakers of English, right? So there were 8 programs that were like that, but the rest, the other 11 were more. They had more speakers of Spanish than English, and there were a couple that was the other way around. They were this 3rd grade data that we work with came from over 1,000 students. They were pretty much the same amount of female and male students. Majority Hispanic, majority to Spanish speakers, 62%. Then we had more than 50% that were ever multilingual learners. So we included former MLs in the group. So we looked at ever multilingual learners. And in our sample, in these 19 Spanish English dual language programs, there was not a lot of diversity in terms of linguistic diversity within the multilingual learners. They were really all Spanish speakers. Or Hispanic at least. And Then when it comes to eligibility for free and reduced lunch, almost 60% of them were eligible for free and reduced lunch. The two assessments that we used, that our own Department of Education had data for, were the Logramos Achievement Assessment. In particular, they didn't have data for all of the subtests within the Logramos, but they had reading data for the reading subtest. So we used that, and then for English we used the summative Smarter Balance reading assessment subtest. We used two multi-level models to estimate the scores on the two assessments across those 3 years in order to predict students' average scores while controlling for student and program level variables. And after fitting those multi-level models, students' predicted scale scores were obtained and aggregated at the program level. So pretty sophisticated statistical analysis. I didn't do the statistical analysis, but I had to report on the results anyway. So what came out of those is two rank order lists by a student's primary language or dominant language, and one per assessment, so separately for the two assessments as well, so that we could look at, outcomes in Spanish, outcomes in English, but also outcomes in Spanish for Spanish speakers, in Spanish for English speakers, and the same thing with the English. So we could pick the programs that were doing a good job at both, right? So if one program was doing a really good job with only Spanish speakers but not English speakers, then we were like, no, or only in Spanish but not in English, we're like, So it had to be somebody that was doing a good job at both. And the two programs that consistently showed the highest adjusted scores in both languages and for both groups of students were identified and selected as case studies. They were different in many ways. The only exception was that they both had whole school dual language programs, but one was in an urban suburban area, the other one in a rural community. One was a public school, K-5, even though there was a continuation into a middle school and even the first year of high school, but they were separate schools within the public school education system. The other one was not a public school. It was in a community, actually, where the public school system did not have any dual language programs. So it was a charter school, K-12. And then one had an 80-20 model and the other one a 50-50 model. For some reason, program B had many more girls, third grade girls that year. I don't know why. And then both were predominantly Hispanic. The students that they served were predominantly Hispanic, especially program B. And program B, the vast majority of the students were eligible for free and reduced lunch, so more economically disadvantaged than the other one. In terms of ever multilingual learners, there were, between a little bit over a quarter to a little bit over a third. And then in terms of, we see that a lot of the Hispanic students, when they enter the program, were not Spanish speakers, because we see those differences in the percentage there for both, but in particular for program B. Okay, so then moving on to research question number 2, I need to take a little bit of water. Okay. So for the more qualitative study, what we did is we visited the two schools during the 2018-2019 school year. So this was prior to the pandemic. And we did classroom visits and listening sessions, and we also collected some extant data. We used the guiding principles for dual language education as the framework for this qualitative part of the project. For those of you who work with dual language programs, I'm sure you are familiar with the guiding principles. If not, I encourage you to take a look. It's available for free, the whole book as a PDF file. It's a CAL publication. This one, the third edition, together with Dual Language Education in Mexico and Vista Higher Learning. And I will go over the strengths in a minute when I share the findings. So we did, as I said, classroom visits we focused on language arts, Spanish and English language arts, because that was the subject that both schools taught every single year in both languages. And then we had listening sessions with students, families, including grandparents, community members, teachers, school administrators, and district administrators. And this is the extent data that we had, any document that they had that was related to the program. I'm going to move a little quicker because I'm looking at the time. So I'm going to focus only on Program B for the findings because unfortunately, Program A was going through a lot of changes that year. They didn't even have a principal, they had an interim principal, and it was just very challenging to do. So we didn't get to do as many visits, and the data is not as robust as the one for Program B. So that's what I'm going to focus on. Again, we followed the findings. I'm going to talk about them in relationship to the 7 strands of the guiding principles, starting with program structure, curriculum, instruction, assessment and accountability, staff quality and PD, family and community, and support and resources. So program structure. So this program had a balanced two-way program. So we had at least a third of the students were Spanish speakers when they entered the program in kindergarten, and a third were native English speakers. They had a 50-50 program starting in first grade, but actually kindergarten was 100% Spanish to boost students' language skills in the partner language in that first year. They had an English teacher and a Spanish teacher, but actually most of the teachers were bilingual, even if they were teaching in English. They separated students for initial literacy in their native language, something we don't see as much anymore in dual language programs, but they were doing that. And then the other core subjects were, in this particular case, they were taught in both languages. In the other school, they varied depending on the grade level. Unfortunately, like in many programs, specials were taught in English. It's hard to find specialists, art, music, PE teachers that can teach in the partner language. Special education, that's also another challenge. I'm seeing more support for special ed in the partner language, especially in Spanish, but we're definitely not there yet. And then one highlight is that they really had a major focus on multilingual learners' needs and serving their needs and supporting them as much as they could. In terms of curriculum, they were using units of study. I don't know if they are still using that. I see a lot of districts are not favoring it as much. There's really not a Spanish language arts component, at least not the full curriculum, but they had scope and sequences for both English and Spanish, so that's something that stood out. Then for instruction, I'm separating what was reported in the listening sessions from what was observed during the classroom visits. So they were adamant about separation of languages. For them, that was important, but they also recognized that it was important to capitalize on cognates, and they had para-educators that were supporting students in Spanish even during English instruction. They talked about reporting using filtering instructional strategies, doing a lot of small group and peer-to-peer interaction and purposeful grouping so that students could help each other out, and also fluid groupings depending on what they were working on. They were not always the same students that were working together, and a big emphasis on writing early on. So what did we observe? Yes, we observed that separation of languages. In many of the classrooms, they had para-educators supporting the multilingual learners. We also observed a very high degree of coordination between Spanish language arts and English language arts, but we didn't really see evidence of, we did quite a few observations in this school, but still, we could have been done when we weren't observing, right? But we didn't really see them bringing the languages together to capitalize on. Oh, I don't know. Somebody else is speaking too, I guess. Okay, so in terms, we did see a lot of strategies for not only sheltering instruction but differentiating, but so giving them the supports, but also knowing when they could progressively take them away so that students could, become independent of them. A huge emphasis on explicit language instruction, in particular during Spanish language arts, a lot of small group work as well with those purposeful and fluid groupings. They had like partners for when they were doing oral work or writing work. They varied, and a big emphasis on writing even in the early grades. Assessment and accountability, they just, and this is a tricky thing, right? You don't want to over-assess the students, but yet you need the data to monitor how they are doing. So they didn't only have, reading assessments in the two languages, which is what we see a lot, but they also had oral language assessment, collective writing samples. They had this logramos assessment that they did as a summative assessment at the end of the year. And of course, they had ELPA 21 for English language proficiency. And then they had weekly data meetings in which they talked about, how the students were doing and how to group them and things like that. There was a mix of veteran and new teachers, but the veteran teachers had been there for a long, long time. And as I said before, the majority were Hispanic and bilingual. They had professional development on sheltering strategies such as GLAD, ORC, also by literacy instruction that actually we did. Cal worked with them prior to this project, and teachers got a lot of opportunities to participate in conferences, in particular for dual language, like Coseta and ATLE. And then also they had training on their language arts curricula. And then they did an amazing job with the families. Really it was a whole family education, K through 12th grade. They had a school-based food pantry, on-site counseling services for students. They did recruitment in a migrant preschool. I saw the parents there. I visited a couple times, and I saw the parents there in the school, like being like we say in Spanish, como Pedro por su casa, just very comfortable. They could speak, the Spanish to anybody in the office. It just felt like home, like a second home for them. What else? They were obligated, the parents, to serve in school event committees. They had to sign up at least for one committee. They have Family Fridays, volunteers. I actually saw this Grandpa Rogers reading with a couple of the students and winter bilingual performances. And the last one is in terms of support and resources. This district did not have any dual language programs. They were not really supportive of dual language or bilingual education, but the program was endorsed by the state, and it had an amazing school administration leadership at the school level. In fact, the program really grew out of a grassroots. It really reminded me a lot of my bilingual school back in the Basque Country, the way it was started. And it did have a lot of community support. I met with the mayor. I met with the director of the cultural center that they had in the community. And it really served, the needs of a small group of the Spanish-speaking families that were there, that lived in that community, and that had decided to stay in the community because of the school, because a lot of them were migrant workers that worked in the field, in the onion, and then they would go, the father typically would go to, whenever it was another they would move to another city or another town for their work, but the family would stay there because of the school. And the teachers reported having, a reasonable amount of resources and discretionary funds to buy resources. But of course, we oftentimes hear educators that teach in Spanish say not all of the resources are authentic or culturally relevant. So this is just a summary of findings. I'm going to move quickly because this, I think I already said all of these things because I want to share at least a little bit about the biliteracy study. So it's called, I'm going to move on. Here it is, Equity in Representing Literacy Growth in Dual Language Bilingual Education for Emerging Bilingual Students. This was a smaller sample, but from the same study, because what happened was that there was a lot of missing data in the Spanish side of things, and we wanted to look at growth. So we needed to have at least 2 points to be able to look at growth, right? So in the end, the sample got reduced to 673 third grade students or data from these many students, and 17 programs of the 19. Here are, I'm gonna give you a minute to look at the student demographics. And then the 2 questions that we wanted to address was just looking at growth rate in Spanish reading achievement using the Logramos subtest. And okay, so there's a typo there. One is supposed to be asking about Spanish, the other one about English. So the second one will be, does the growth rate in English reading achievement differ for ever MLs and never MLs? So we were comparing those 2 groups, and you may say that that's not a fair comparison. I agree with you in a way, but that's usually the way a lot of the research that has looked at outcomes of multilingual learners has done it. So, but at least we're including Spanish outcomes. So in order to answer those questions, we estimated a 3-level linear growth model using hierarchical linear modeling on a student's Spanish and English grade 3 through 5 reading scale scores, at least 2 data points, while controlling for student demographics and program level characteristics, which in the end, they ended up not making any difference, the program level characteristics. And these are the findings. So this is for Spanish. So here we see that students are making progress from 3rd grade to 4th to 5th grade in both languages. And the ever multilingual learners, the Spanish speaking students, are performing better than the English speaking students, okay, in Spanish. In English, we see the reverse. Well, we see first that they are both groups are making progress. One thing that I want to mention is the scale in this graph and the scale in the one before are different, so we cannot make comparisons in terms of the distance between the 2 lines, but we do see the reverse, right? We see that students, native English speakers, are doing better in English than in Spanish, but they're both making progress, and we were looking at growth in these cases. So that's what I said, but I haven't mentioned the statistically significant part, right? So what we found out is that actually in Spanish reading, both groups made progress, right? But never MLs, these are your native English speakers, exhibited a statistically significantly higher growth rates in Spanish than Spanish-speaking kids from home, okay? So they both made progress, but the native English speakers made significantly more progress in Spanish reading. Why? Maybe because they had more to grow, perhaps, or maybe because the Spanish speaking didn't make as much growth because the Spanish the rigor wasn't there for them. Like they weren't really challenged to make more growth. We don't know really, because we were just looking at the outcome data. In English, interestingly enough, there was not that difference. The growth rate was not statistically significantly different for the two groups. So in summary, both groups grew at the same rate in English reading from 3rd through 5th grade, but never MLs grew more than ever MLs in Spanish reading. So just to conclude, just, the importance of looking at students' progress in both program languages. And this may seem like a no-brainer, but really most of the research that we have that's focused on student outcomes in these programs really is based on English outcomes only. And the fact that the importance of looking at outcomes longitudinally too. This was, it was not a huge, but it was 3 data points at least. And by doing so, by looking at both languages, we're not only going to be more accurately representing the students' biliteracy development, but also, we are going to be underscoring the value of their language background. So of course, there are some limitations. The results only account for 3 data points. Unfortunately, it's just so challenging to do, in particular for this school, it did have the whole, K through 12, but unfortunately, the students in the middle school and high school did not take the logramos. So it was only the students in the elementary grades that took the logramos, so we didn't have data for them, because ideally we want to look at also at the middle school grades, because we know that many times that's when we see the benefits of dual language education. And we're only using summative achievement data, right? So it's just one data point a year. And we know that that's not the way we look at students' achievement, right? That we should look also at the results of formative assessments. Then the study is limited to Spanish and English. We tried, but again, we only had Spanish assessment data, and we looked at literacy development in the 2 languages separately, right? And there were 2 different assessments as well. So if there are assessment folks in the audience, I'm looking forward to the date we have an assessment that is able to look at that biliteracy development just in one assessment to assess students' biliteracy development. And these are just the references, acknowledging our funder. And I don't know how much funding there's going to be out there from now on. Pretty scary. Un placer. And I'm all yours.
Wow, thank you